1 year after the first contact disaster at Concordia Station, the galaxy was a very different place than it had been before the Devourers arrived. Admiral Jake Morrison stood in the command center on Earth and looked at reports from across what remained of galactic civilization. Of the 47 species that had once been part of the Galactic Alliance, fewer than 20 still had organized governments, and most of those were hiding in secret locations. The beautiful crystal cities of the Zephyrians were empty and silent. The great libraries of the Keldans had been consumed along with the minds that had created them over thousands of years. Entire species that had existed for millions of years had vanished in a matter of months, leaving behind only empty planets and the echoing silence of extinction. But the Devourer advance had finally been stopped. Human fleets supported by alien refugees and the few species still capable of organized resistance had managed to halt the consumption of the galaxy's remaining intelligent life. Defensive lines had been established around the core systems, and for the first time since the war began, the survivors could think about something other than just running and hiding. President Karen Wells activated the quantum communication system that connected Earth to hidden refuges scattered across the galaxy. Her image appeared simultaneously in asteroid mining facilities where Keldan survivors huddled together, in cloaked space stations where Zephyrian enclaves lived under human protection, and in dozens of other secret locations where the remnants of galactic civilization waited to learn if they would live or die. "My fellow beings of the galaxy," Karen began. Her voice carried across impossible distances by technology that bent the laws of physics. "We have survived the first phase of the Devourer War, but survival alone is not enough. These creatures will continue to hunt us until every intelligent mind in the galaxy has been consumed unless we take action to stop them permanently." The plan that Karen outlined would have horrified the old Galactic Council and violated every treaty that the peaceful species had signed over thousands of years of civilization. Human fleets would not attempt to negotiate with or understand the Devourers. Instead, they would implement what military strategists called the Terran Protocol, the complete and systematic extermination of an enemy that could not be reasoned with. General Ryan Clark coordinated the final offensive from Earth's orbital command center, and he had resources that would have been impossible to imagine when humans first joined the Galactic Alliance. Ships crewed by mixed species teams combined alien technology with human tactical innovation in ways that created capabilities neither species could have achieved alone. The weapons that human engineers had developed in secret were now combined with the scientific knowledge of species that had been studying the universe for millions of years. Zephyrian biotechnology was merged with human kinetic weapons to create ammunition that could disrupt the neural networks that Devourers used to process stolen memories. Keldan computational systems were linked to human artificial intelligence programs to create tactical coordination networks faster than any biological mind. But the real advantage was psychological. The Devourers had built their entire strategy around harvesting the minds of creatures that thought like diplomats and scientists and philosophers. They had consumed thousands of brilliant beings who approached problems through analysis and negotiation and careful consideration of all possible options. They had never encountered the mindset of human warriors who had spent their entire evolutionary history learning that some problems could only be solved through decisive violence. The human approach to the Devourer threat was simple and direct: find them and destroy them completely before they could consume any more innocent lives. Jake Morrison led the attack on the primary Devourer fleet from the bridge of his new ship called the Vengeance. The ship had been built using technology from 12 different species, but its design philosophy was purely human. Maximum firepower delivered with overwhelming speed and accuracy. Around him flew ships crewed by aliens who had learned to think like human marines and humans who had learned to use alien science in ways that its creators had never imagined. The Devourers fought back with everything they had learned from consuming the galaxy's greatest minds, but they discovered that knowledge and wisdom were not the same thing. They knew the technical specifications of every weapon system in the galaxy, but they did not understand the psychology of beings who had learned that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to become monsters themselves. Battle lasted for days as human-led fleets systematically destroyed every devourer ship they could find. There were no attempts at communication or negotiation, no efforts to understand devourer culture or motivations, no consideration of whether these creatures had families or feelings or rights that should be respected. The humans had learned from their own history that some enemies could not be reformed or reasoned with, and the only way to stop them was to ensure that they no longer existed. The galaxy's peaceful species watched in amazement and horror as their primitive allies implemented a solution that their advanced civilizations could never have contemplated. When the last devourer ship fell silent and empty in the darkness of space, the survivors began to count the cost of their survival. Billions of beings had died and entire civilizations had been wiped from existence. The galaxy would never be the same, and the species that remained would carry the memory of what they had lost for the rest of their existence. But in the aftermath of the war, as reconstruction began under human military protection, something unexpected happened. The surviving species began to understand that they had misjudged the newest members of their alliance. Humans had not joined the Galactic Council to learn peace and enlightenment. They had joined to prepare for threats that the peaceful species could not imagine. The warnings that Jake Morrison had delivered to the Galactic Council had not been the paranoid delusions of a primitive species. They had been tactical assessments from beings who understood that the universe was not always a safe place for the weak and unprepared. The human military preparations that had seemed excessive and frightening were revealed to be the minimum necessary precautions for survival in a galaxy that contained predators. As the years passed and the galaxy slowly healed under human protection, the former council members began to appreciate an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes peace could only be maintained by beings who remembered how to wage war effectively. Sometimes civilization required guardians who were willing to do terrible things to prevent even more terrible things from happening to the innocent. The galaxy had ignored human warnings about external threats, but they would never again underestimate humanity's solutions to problems that threatened the survival of intelligent life itself. President Karen Wells sat in the emergency meeting room deep under the ground in Washington and looked at the faces of Earth's most important military leaders. The news from Concordia Station had reached Earth only hours ago, but already the government was moving to put secret plans into action that had been years in the making. General Ryan Clark stood at the front of the room next to a huge screen that showed a map of the galaxy with red dots marking every place where devourer ships had been seen. The red dots were spreading like a disease across the map, and each one represented millions of dead aliens whose brains had been harvested by creatures that saw intelligence as food. "Madam President," Ryan said in his deep voice, "our worst fears have been confirmed. The devourers are not interested in territory or resources. They consume the neural patterns of every intelligent species they encounter, and this, makes them smarter and more dangerous with each attack." Karen studied the tactical displays that covered the walls of the room. She had been president for only 2 years, but she had been preparing for this moment since the day she took office. Earth's leaders had always known that joining the Galactic Alliance was dangerous because it meant depending on aliens who had forgotten how to fight for their survival. "What are our allies doing?" she asked, even though she already suspected the answer would not be good. Ryan's face became grim as he changed the display to show the current status of the galaxy's major powers. "The Keldons are trying to negotiate with the Devourers by offering them other species as tribute. They think they can buy safety by sacrificing smaller worlds. The Zephyrians have closed their borders and retreated to their core systems. Most of the other species are either fleeing or trying to make individual peace deals." Lieutenant Colonel Danny Ross stepped forward from where he had been standing near the back of the room. He had just returned from a secret mission to observe Devourer attacks, and his report made everyone in the room understand how serious the situation had become. "Madam President," Danny said, "the Devourers are not just killing people randomly. They are learning from every mind they consume. Each attack is more sophisticated than the last because they understand our weaknesses better than we do." Karen felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what this meant. The diplomatic team at Concordia Station had included experts on military defense, political structure, and economic systems from dozens of different species. All of that knowledge was now inside the minds of creatures that wanted to consume every intelligent being in the galaxy. "How much time do we have?" she asked. Based on their current rate of advance, the Devourers will reach the core systems of the galaxy within 18 months, Ryan answered. But that assumes they maintain their current tactics. If they use the knowledge they gained from the diplomatic team, they could move much faster. Karen made the decision that would change humanity's place in galactic history. Initiate Project Prometheus immediately. All spending restrictions are suspended and all classified research programs are now top priority. Dr. Patricia Bell had been waiting for this moment for 10 years. She was the head of Earth's most secret weapons research program, and she had been developing technologies that would horrify the peaceful species of the Galactic Alliance. She activated a holographic display that showed weapons and ships unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. "Madam President," Patricia said with excitement in her voice, "we have been preparing for this day since Earth first joined the Alliance. While the other species shared their peaceful technologies with us, they never asked what humans were developing in secret. Their display showed orbital bombardment, platforms that could destroy entire cities from space. There were ships designed not for exploration, but for war with armor thick enough to survive direct hits from the most powerful weapons. Computer viruses that could shut down entire planetary defense networks. Weapons that could disrupt the neural patterns of living creatures." Karen looked around the room and saw the faces of people who had spent their entire careers preparing for a war that everyone else thought would never come. Earth's military had learned from every species in the galaxy, but they had combined that knowledge with something that the peaceful aliens had lost long ago, the understanding that sometimes survival required the willingness to be absolutely ruthless. "The other species think we are primitive because we still remember how to fight," Ryan said as he pointed to the display of human weapons. "They forgot that evolution favors the species that can adapt to any threat." Danny added his own observations from the field. "The Devourers expect their victims to try negotiation first and violence only as a last resort. They have built their entire strategy around harvesting the minds of creatures who think like diplomats and scientists. But humans think like predators." Karen studied the plans that her people had been developing in secret for 20 years. Earth had used its time in the Galactic Alliance to learn about alien technology and psychology, but they had never forgotten the lessons that evolution had taught them on their home world. Sometimes the universe produced threats that could only be stopped by creatures willing to be monsters. "What about the other species?" she asked. "Will any of them fight alongside us?" Patricia brought up another display that showed the current military capabilities of Earth's allies. Most of the galaxy's weapons are designed for peacekeeping and crowd control. Their ships are built for exploration, and their soldiers are trained for rescue operations. Only a few species have anything that could be called a real military. Ryan nodded in agreement. "The species that might be willing to fight are either too small to make a difference or too far away to reach us in time. If Earth is going to stop the Devourers, we will have to do it mostly alone." Karen felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Humanity had tried to warn the galaxy about the threat that was coming, but the aliens had been too arrogant to listen. Now Earth would have to save creatures who had dismissed them as primitive warmongers. But as she looked at the weapons and strategies that her people had developed, she felt a surge of confidence. Humans had survived on a world where everything wanted to kill them, and they had learned to be the most dangerous predators in any ecosystem. The Devourers had made the mistake of assuming that intelligence and wisdom were the same thing. They were about to learn why evolution had produced at least one species that remembered how to be absolutely ruthless when survival was at stake. Colonel Gary Turner walked through the metal corridors of Kepler Station and looked at the faces of alien refugees who had never seen war before. The space station was crowded with survivors from 6 different species who had fled their homeworlds when the Devourers arrived. Now they were depending on human marines to protect them from creatures that their governments had thought could be negotiated with. The Zephyrians huddled together in groups and their skin changed colors to show their fear and confusion. They had lived for thousands of years without violence, and they could not understand why anyone would want to hurt them. The young Keldan refugees asked endless questions about human weapons and tactics because their analytical minds needed to understand everything, even when understanding would not save them. Gary had been a Marine for 15 years, and he had fought in conflicts all over human space, but this was different. He was not just fighting to protect human colonies or trade routes. He was fighting to protect the idea that intelligent life had a right to exist without being consumed by predators that saw consciousness itself as food. "Colonel," said Captain Rachel Morgan as she approached Gary near the station's command center, "our scouts report that the Devourer fleet will arrive within 6 hours. We count at least 20 ships and they are moving in formation, like they have done this many times before." Gary nodded and continued his inspection of the defensive positions that his Marines had set up. Throughout the station, the corridors were now filled with weapons emplacements and sensor arrays that would detect approaching enemies. But Gary knew that technology alone would not be enough to stop creatures that had consumed the knowledge of the galaxy's greatest military minds. The human defenders had advantages that the Devourers did not expect. Earth's military had spent 20 years studying alien psychology, and they understood how different species thought and fought. But more importantly, they remembered lessons that the peaceful species of the galaxy had forgotten. Sometimes survival required the willingness to do terrible things to terrible enemies. As Gary moved through the station, he stopped to talk with the alien refugees, and he was surprised by what he learned. The young Keldans were fascinated by human military equipment, and they wanted to help with the defense even though they had never held weapons before. Some of the Zephyrians had volunteered to work with human technicians to modify the station's systems for combat. "Your species is very strange," said a Keldan scientist named Vorth as he examined a human rifle. "You build tools for creating death with the same care that we use to build tools for creating knowledge." Gary smiled grimly as he checked the weapons settings. "On Earth, we learned that sometimes you have to destroy your enemies completely, or they will come back stronger. The creatures that are coming here do not want to negotiate or coexist. They want to eat our brains and add our knowledge to their own." When the Devourer ships finally appeared on the station's sensors, Gary was ready for them. The defense plan that he and his Marines had developed used everything that humans had learned about the enemy combined with modifications to alien technology that would have been illegal under Galactic Alliance law. The station's shields had been changed so that they did not just block incoming energy but redirected it through amplification systems that turned the Devourer's own weapons against them. The computer networks used artificial intelligence programs that could adapt faster than any living mind and coordinate defenses across multiple systems simultaneously. Rachel led her fighter squadron out to meet the Devourer ships, and she was flying a ship that combined alien propulsion technology with human weapon systems and tactical doctrine. Her pilots had trained for years to fight enemies that most of the galaxy thought did not exist. "All fighters remember the mission," Rachel broadcast to her squadron. "These things get stronger every time they consume an intelligent mind. Our job is to make sure they do not get the chance to feed." The battle began when the Devourer ships tried to attach themselves to Kepler Station using the same tactics they had used on hundreds of other targets. But instead of finding helpless victims, they encountered defensive systems that had been designed by a species that understood predator and prey relationships. Human Marines moved through the station's corridors using tactics that confused the Devourers because they were based on principles that peaceful species had never needed to learn. The aliens had always solved their problems through negotiation and compromise, but humans had learned to solve problems through decisive action and overwhelming force. The Devourers had consumed the minds of diplomats and scientists and engineers, but they had never consumed the mind of a human warrior. They did not understand the psychology of a species that had spent millions of years competing with other predators for survival. When the Devourers tried to use fear and intimidation, they found that humans responded to threats by becoming more dangerous rather than more compliant. Gary coordinated the defense from the station's command center, and he watched as his Marines and the alien volunteers worked together to stop an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. The Zephyrians used their natural ability to change their skin color to confuse Devourer sensors. The Keldans used their analytical minds to find weaknesses in Devourer technology that human intuition had missed. But the real advantage came from something that the galaxy's peaceful species had never developed: the human understanding that some enemies could only be defeated by being destroyed completely. The Devourers expected their victims to try capture and study, rather than kill, and the human approach of total destruction caught them completely off guard. When the last Devourer ship exploded in a ball of fire, Rachel and her pilots returned to the station as heroes. But Gary knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger war. News of the human victory would spread across the galaxy, and other species would start to understand that their newest and most primitive allies might be their only hope for survival. The refugees on Kepler Station had learned something important during the battle. The humans they had looked down on as violent and primitive were actually the inheritors of evolutionary lessons that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. Sometimes the universe required guardians who remembered how to be predators when survival was at stake. Admiral Rick Hayes stood on the bridge of his ship called the Defiance and watched through the big window as the diplomatic ship called Harmony moved slowly toward the dark fleet of devourer ships. 6 months had passed since Jake Morrison had warned the Galactic Council, and now the aliens were finally going to meet the creatures that humans had been afraid of for so long. Rick did not like this planet. All but the Galactic Council had ordered him to stay back and let the diplomats do their job. His ship was supposed to watch from a safe distance and only help if the diplomats asked for it. But Rick had been a soldier for 30 years, and he knew that some enemies could not be reasoned with. The Harmony was a beautiful ship that had been built specifically for peaceful meetings with new species. It had no weapons, and its hull was painted bright white with symbols of peace from dozens of different alien cultures. Inside the ship were the galaxy's best diplomats, and they were excited to make history by being the first to talk with the Devourers. Commander Amy Foster sat at her station and monitored all the electronic signals coming from both fleets. She was one of the best technicians in the human fleet, and she could read energy patterns better than most computers. "Sir," she said to Rick, "the Devourer ships are giving off strange readings that do not match anything in our databases." Rick nodded and kept watching the diplomatic mission unfold. "Keep recording everything, Foster. Earth Command wants every detail of what happens here today." The meeting was going to take place on a neutral space station called Concordia that floated between the two fleets. The station had been built just for occasions like this, when different species needed a safe place to meet and talk. It had rooms designed for creatures that breathed different kinds of air and ate different kinds of food. Rick watched as small shuttle ships left the Harmony and flew toward the space station. The shuttles carried ambassadors from 12 different alien species, including the chief diplomat of the Keldans and the high speaker of the Zephyrians. These were some of the most important and intelligent beings in the galaxy, and they were confident that they could solve any problem through careful negotiation. At the same time, shuttle ships from the Devourer fleet also flew toward the space station. Rick used his ship's powerful telescopes to look at the Devourer shuttles, and he saw that they were just as dark and sharp as their larger ships. Through the windows of the shuttles, he could see tall figures wearing long robes, but he could not see their faces clearly. "The first meeting is beginning," Amy reported as she listened to the communication signals from the space station. "All diplomatic protocols are being followed, and the initial greetings seem to be going well. For almost an hour, everything seemed normal. The communication channels carried the usual sounds of translation machines working to help different species understand each other. Rick heard the formal speeches that diplomats always gave when meeting new species for the first time. The Keldan ambassador was talking about the benefits of joining the Galactic Alliance, and the Zephyrian representative was explaining their philosophy of peaceful coexistence, but then Amy's instruments started showing readings that made no sense. "Admiral, I am detecting massive power surges from the Devourer ships. Their energy output just increased by 300% in the last 30 seconds. Rick felt his heart start beating faster, and he moved closer to Amy's station. "What kind of power are they generating?" "I do not know, sir. The patterns are unlike anything we have in our records. It is almost like they are charging some kind of weapon, but the energy signature is completely unknown." Before Rick could respond, the Flyborn communication channel from Concordia Station suddenly filled with the sound of screaming. It was not the screaming of one person, but the screaming of many people all at once, and it was a sound of pure terror that made everyone on the bridge of the Defiance freeze in horror. "All stations, emergency broadcast," came a voice from Concordia Station, and Rick could hear the panic in the speaker's words. "The Devourers are not what they seemed. They are attacking the diplomatic team. Request immediate assistance." Through his telescopes, Rick could see that the Devourer shuttles were still docked at the space station, but something was very wrong. The lights inside the station were flickering, and he could see dark shapes moving through the corridors where the diplomats had been meeting. "Sir, the Harmony is trying to leave. Amy shouted. They are powering up their engines and attempting to break. Away from the Devourer fleet, Rick watched, in horror as the beautiful white diplomatic ship tried to escape from the trap that the galaxy's best minds had walked into. But the Devourer ships moved faster than anything Rick had ever seen, and they surrounded the Harmony before it could get away. Energy beams shot out from the dark ships and the Harmony exploded in a bright flash that could be seen from millions of miles away. All ships, Code Black Protocol. Rick ordered his fleet. Emergency jump to Earth immediately. Do not stop to help anyone and do not try to fight the Devourer ships. The Code Black Protocol was Earth's secret plan for what to do if first contact went badly. Every human ship was supposed to run away as fast as possible and report back to Earth about what they had seen. Rick hated to leave the space station behind, but he knew that staying would only get his people killed too. As the Defiance prepared to jump through space, Rick took one last look at Concordia Station. The station was now dark and quiet, and he knew that everyone inside was probably dead. The galaxy's finest diplomats and most experienced negotiators had been killed in minutes by creatures that the Galactic Council had thought could be reasoned with. The jump through space took only a few seconds, but it felt like hours to Rick. When his ship arrived at Earth, he immediately sent his report to the human government and to what was left of the Galactic Council. The message was simple and terrible. First contact had been made with the Devourers, but it was not a meeting of two intelligent species trying to understand each other. It was a feeding, and the Devourers had just consumed some of the galaxy's greatest minds along with all their knowledge and memories. Now the creatures that had been moving toward the center of the galaxy knew everything that the diplomats had known about the locations of planets, the strength of defenses, and the political structure of every major species. The galaxy had ignored human warnings about the Devourers, and now they would pay the price for their arrogance. But Earth had been preparing for this day, and Rick knew that the real war was just beginning. Commander Jake Morrison walked into the huge meeting hall on the planet called Zirion Prime, and he felt small compared to all the giant alien beings around him. The place was so big that his voice would echo if he spoke too loud. All around him sat creatures that looked nothing like humans, and they had been ruling the galaxy for thousands of years before Earth even knew that space travel was possible. The Galactic Council was the most important group in the galaxy, and Jake was there to give them a warning that could save everyone. He carried a small device in his hand that would show them pictures and videos of something terrible that was coming toward them all. But as he looked around the room, he could see that most of the aliens were not taking him seriously. A tall blue creature with 6 arms was talking to another alien that looked like a giant jellyfish floating in the air. They were making sounds that the translation machines turned into laughter. Jake knew they were laughing at him and at Earth, because humans were still new to space travel, and the aliens thought humans were not smart enough to understand big problems. Jake pressed the button on his device, and a huge picture appeared in the air above everyone. It showed dark ships moving through space, and these ships were different from anything anyone had ever seen before. They were black and sharp, and they moved like hunters looking for prey. Behind them were planets that had no life left on them. These ships belonged to something we call the Devourers, Jake said, and his voice was carried to every creature in the room by the translation machines. Our space stations at the edge of the galaxy saw them coming 18 months ago, and we have been watching them ever since. The leader of the Galactic Council was a creature called Chief Arbiter Kelton, and he had many eyes on long stems that could look in different directions at the same time. He moved 2 of his eyes to look at Jake while the others kept looking at different parts of the room. "Human Morrison," he said in a voice that sounded bored, "your species has only been part of our alliance for 200 years, and in that time you have warned us about dangers that never came to pass." Jake felt his anger rising, but he kept his voice calm. "This is different, and the proof is right here in front of you. These Devourer ships have destroyed 12 planets already, and they are moving toward the center of the galaxy where all of our worlds are located." Lisa Carter stepped forward from where she had been standing behind Jake. She was Earth's best scientist when it came to studying alien life, and she had spent years learning about all the different creatures in the galaxy. She was holding a small container that had something inside it that looked like black liquid, but Jake knew it was much worse than that. "We found this substance on one of the planets that the Devourers attacked," Lisa said as she held up the container. It used to be part of a living brain, and our tests show that the devourers do not just kill the creatures they find. They eat their brains and take all their knowledge and memories. The room became quiet for a moment as the aliens looked at the container. But then a Zephyrian delegate made a sound like wind blowing through leaves, and the translation machine said, "Your species has always been violent, and you see enemies everywhere you look because that is your nature." Jake wanted to shout at them, but he knew that would only make things worse. The aliens in this room came from worlds where there had been no wars for thousands of years. They had forgotten what it was like to fight for survival, and they thought that all problems could be solved by talking. But the devourers were not interested in talking. "Look at these pictures," Jake said as he made the device show more images. "Every planet they visit becomes empty of all life. The buildings are still there, but every living creature is gone. Their brains have been harvested and their bodies left to rot." Chief Arbiter Kelton made a sound that the translation machine turned into a sigh. "Commander Morrison, your people come from a world where creatures fought each other for millions of years. You cannot imagine that some beings might prefer peace over violence because peace is not in your nature." Lisa tried again to make them understand. "We are not asking you to fight anyone. We are asking you to prepare defenses and to move your most important people to safe places until we know more about what the devourers want." But the aliens were not listening anymore. A creature that looked like a walking tree said, "Perhaps these devourers simply need food and we can negotiate a trade agreement with them." Another alien that was covered in shining scales said, "Every species has a right to exist, and we should try to understand their culture before we judge them." Jake looked around the room and saw that his warnings were falling on deaf ears. These creatures had lived in peace for so long that they could not believe that something might want to destroy them, just because it could. They thought that every problem had a peaceful solution, because that was all they had ever known. The vote was taken, and it was not even close. 43 species voted to send a diplomatic mission to make contact with the devourers and try to negotiate with them. Only 4 species voted with Earth to prepare for war, and most of those were small worlds that had joined the alliance recently. As Jake and Lisa walked out of the meeting hall, they both knew that they had failed. The galaxy was going to try to make friends with creatures that saw them as nothing more than food. But Earth would not be caught unprepared, and Jake was already thinking about the secret plans that his government had been making for situations just like this one. "They will learn," Jake said quietly to Lisa as they got onto their ship. "But by the time they understand that we were right, it might be too late for all of us."